A fight over faith in uniform. Secretary Hegseth is stepping in to protect military chaplains amid growing concerns their beliefs are under pressure. Is that about religious freedom, military discipline, or both? The debate is heating up. Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists that we have with us for today. First, we have Mr. Todd McFarland, General Counsel of the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We also have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. We have Mr. Andre Wong, General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we also have Dr. Timothy Golden, Professor of Philosophy at Whitman College. Gentlemen, great having you here again. Looking forward to our show. You know, the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, recently released a video that was announcing immediate changes to directives given to military chaplains. The Secretary described the original intent of chaplains, that they are to be the spiritual and moral background of our nation's forces. That role, however, in his mind has been degraded. The Secretary claims that it is because of an atmosphere of politics. As a result, the Secretary now has moved to two changes that he would like to see happen. First and foremost, he'd like to see the rank of chaplains no longer be posted on their uniforms. And secondarily, he'd like to shrink the number of religious groups that are represented in chaplaincy. You know, Tim Golden, this is an interesting concept because chaplaincy is such an interesting position. Most people don't even know that chaplaincy existed even before the Constitution of the United States. So the idea that we're kind of tinkering with this, we're stripping ranks to some degree, we're trying to shrink the number of faiths, it seems as though it's going contrary to what chaplaincy is all about, or maybe I'm missing something. You know, what are your thoughts on that, Tim?
Well, first of all, I have great respect for Pete Hegseth's military record, right? He has a distinguished record of military service, and he's very accomplished, and all of those things are true. That does not necessarily mean that he's qualified to lead the Defense Department, right? There's a lot of people who have distinguished military records that I greatly respect, but I'm not so sure that they would qualify to serve in that office. That said, he holds the office, and I'm concerned more about the idea that there would be fewer groups represented in the chaplaincy. That's the part that concerns me. If every American who meets the qualifications to serve in the military and may be of different faiths is able to do that and qualified to do that, then every religious group that is represented in chaplaincy ought to be able to hold that office and not be reduced because of the secretary's concerns, whatever they may be. And I mean, just pardon me on this, but I think it's difficult for me and for a lot of people to separate what is a legitimate military directive from the injection of partisan politics into what is happening in our military. So I have concerns that the people who are eligible to serve in the military, if the number of chaplains are reduced and the number of faiths represented are reduced, then that could reduce the number of faiths represented in the people who are actually serving in the military, which could be a problem for those individuals. So I think it ought to be proportional. If everyone who's qualified serves in the military, then as many religious groups as possible ought to be represented in the chaplaincy. So that's my real concern about that.
Orland, if I can, I mean, I agree that faiths in the military and chaplaincy should be multi-faith, and it shouldn't be restricted. I'm not sure that's what Secretary Hegseth was doing. Getting rid of the categories, which is really going back to what it was before an expansion in the prior administration, is different than who can serve. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that we've seen an example of any ecclesiastical endorser recognized by the military being denied because of their faith, or any chaplain endorsed by ecclesiastical endorser being denied because of their faith. If that were to happen, I would agree with Dr. Golden that that would be a problem. But I don't know that reducing the number of categories makes much difference one way or another. I think this was mainly a signaling exercise by the secretary.
But Andre, it's kind of interesting. It seems as though the idea of having your military rank being displayed, he believes, should be a little bit different for chaplains, where maybe we would have a cross that's displayed, or something that kind of designates what religious group that you, quote unquote, may be affiliated with personally. I guess my real question is, if chaplaincy is really about the idea that it shouldn't matter what your specific religion is because you're not supposed to be proselytizing in any way, the idea of downplaying one's rank, because chaplains consider themselves to be as much a part of the military as anything else from the ones that I've come in contact with.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, chaplains have always played a critical role in the armed forces. Service members operate in areas that are isolating, dangerous, and let's face it, morally complicated. So chaplains provide not only religious guidance, but they're also critical for morale. They provide ethical guidance and emotional support. So strengthening that role can really help the mental health challenges and isolation, and ensure that our service members are free to practice their faith when they're deployed. But at the same time, yes, the military is a pluralistic institution. Chaplains must serve members of all faiths and members of no faith, without any favoritism or coercion. So if this is perceived as privileging certain religious perspectives, or if chaplains are placed in roles that blur the line between spiritual care and command influence, that can really undermine trust and unit cohesion. So the military has to be especially careful here of its hierarchical structure, when subtle pressure can feel compulsory.
So I think a pretty interesting sort of aspect of this, Orland, is, you have the formality of what Hegseth did, but then there's this sort of background stuff about Hegseth that I think kind of has to inform how you look at this. If you know Dr. Tim Golden, you know that he's a philosopher, an intellectual, a fan of crime dramas. Every interaction you have with him is going to be based upon your knowledge of him. And when we see something that Pete Hegseth does, we have to take into account that he has been talked about religion and the military more than any defense secretary in history. And he also is the one actual public figure that is most associated with actual Christian nationalism. Now, I think the term Christian nationalism has come to encompass a broad set of perfectly benign, discussions of religion and politics. I think a lot of people on the political left would look at our discussions and say that's Christian nationalism. But I think Hegseth's version of Christian nationalism is the genuine article, because his spiritual mentor is the Moscow, Idaho pastor named Douglas Wilson. Hegseth attends a Wilson church plant in D.C., and Wilson is a self-described Christian nationalist who believes that women should not have the right to vote. Quite openly, he said this as recently as this year. He believes that husbands should vote for wives. He believes that the institution of chattel slavery in the United States wasn't entirely unjust. So Hegseth's public association with a figure like that, everything that he does in a space like this is going to be refracted through what we know about Hegseth and his association. Again, I would say Hegseth has every right to his own freedom of religion. He has every right to go to the church he goes to. And I'm not even really going to criticize it, even though I would disagree with him theologically. But I think that having the Secretary of State sort of make it clear that he views the boundaries of separation of church and state in a quite different way than even most evangelical conservative Christians do, I think that just kind of has to be on the table in the way we understand these kinds of discussions.
Yeah, Todd, you and I, we sit on a lot of boards that deal with chaplaincy. The uniqueness is they are actually the only individuals in the military who are both military and American citizen, or citizen that's deemed to be outside the military at the same time. And I wonder if just that juxtaposition of the different roles that they play and how they viewed, and the fact that they've been around before the Constitution, that it's making it a little messy for anybody to really understand sometimes what their roles should be in an ever-changing society.
Well, it is true that military chaplains do play a role that almost anyone else in the U.S. government doing it in their capacity would be problematic. I mean, they preach sermons, they perform services, they can and do speak in their own faith's tradition. But as you said, this has existed. It needs to exist. You can't serve the military members' needs outside of having a chaplaincy corps. You can't just go to your local church when you're in Iraq or Afghanistan or Iran or wherever you happen to be. Unquestionably, Hegseth was pushing back on some worrying trends and trying to basically, quiet chaplains and penalize chaplains for what they were saying. Having said that, as both Tim said, has he taken this too far? It is important to understand the context to which he's saying this. And I think that's what's giving a lot of people pause more than just the words he's saying themselves.
Yeah, Tim Golden, I think it's the slippery slope everyone's concerned with, right? We kind of know what your general mindset is in the public. We see you kind of pulling that in a little bit into what's going on in your everyday life in the military. Just saying the word military gets people a little bit sensitive. And it seems like that's probably the concern. You're doing this today, but what are we going to announce tomorrow? Because it seems like every week something new is going on.
Hey, it's difficult in this hyper partisan environment we live in nowadays in Washington to separate the personal religious commitments, as Tim Schultz pointed out, of Pete Hegseth from what he's actually doing in these initiatives in the military. So Tim Schultz is probably right about this. This is, for all of our uses of the phrase Christian nationalism, this one probably is the real McCoy, right? Because we see Pete Hegseth through this Christian nationalist lens, and this reduction in chaplaincy representation of other faiths is, I think, a concern because of that.
I think saying, Tim Schultz is probably right about that. Could we just play that on a loop at the end of every show?
Well,
I was thinking about making that my ringtone.
I got to tell you, the more we think about what's going on, in particular the military and politics, and I think hopefully what we're trying to do is to get to a point where this is one segment of society that views themselves as being apolitical, and wanting to make sure that it kind of stays in that vein. And hopefully we don't engage in anything that will start to cause that to be murky or confusing, in particular for the American people. Coming up, should secular celebrants be allowed to officiate marriages? A Texan lawsuit argues yes. Stay right here. We'll be right back. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith in Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. There's an interesting case that deals with the idea of who should officiate marriages in Texas. The case is called McCutchan versus Nicholson. Texas law has long specified who may officiate marriages: Christian ministers and priests, rabbis, and as well as federal and state judges in Texas are authorized to perform these ceremonies and even sign marriage licenses. Texas law also more broadly permits an officer of any religious organization to officiate weddings. Anyone else who conducts a ceremony without that authority commits a criminal offense and risks fines. A secular humanist group filed a lawsuit seeking to have its secular celebrants allowed to officiate as well, even though they are admittedly not religious and generally anti-religious. Todd, when I take a look at these type of cases, one, it seems like states are trying to set out boundaries regarding what should happen in the area of, for example, marriage. And really, marriage is kind of religious, but it's also something that's a public sphere. You have to get a license from a local government. But in the same breath, most people view it as something that is connecting to their God or to their religion in some way. When you start creating new groups of individuals that can be the ones that officiate marriages, are we really concerned about this? Is it a big deal? Is this much to do about nothing? But we find ourselves in court fighting about this in some form or fashion, which means it's important to one group of society, and obviously another group of society is pushing back on it. I mean, what are your thoughts when we see these type of cases?
Well, I think especially in this particular case where you have this institution, the Center for, Inquiry, this seems to be more of a lawsuit driven than desire driven, and that's what the Fifth Circuit held. Right? They said, listen, you haven't really shown that you're going to engage in this conduct, and this does seem to be something that was the Center for Inquiry. Sorry, I got the name wrong. Was just trying to gin up. And why do I say that? Well, it's what the Fifth Circuit said. First of all, they hadn't really done this before. This was an advocacy organization, not kind of some type of secular, marriage organization or some type of entity that traditionally did this. Second, they didn't demonstrate anyone who wanted to have them perform a marriage. They said, there's secular celebrants who want to do this. But you know what they didn't do? They didn't have those people as plaintiffs. They didn't have those individuals listed in the complaint. As someone who's done pre-enforcement actions, I mean, we know what it takes to get over what's called standing, right? And you have to be very concrete. And that's what the Center of Inquiry couldn't or didn't do, and I suspect they couldn't do. As to the broader issue, I do think that, states have a right to define religion in a way, not that preferences one religion over another, but that says this has to meet the indicia of religious as we've historically and traditionally known that. And the Center for Inquiry is putting itself opposite of that. So it's not saying we're a different religion, they're saying and rejecting all religion. Absolutely their constitutional right to do, but that doesn't mean they get protections for religion, which are specifically and specially mentioned in the Constitution, as opposed to the activities they want to engage in, which don't get that same level of protection.
Orland, I would just say that was a really good answer by Todd, but to me, the best part of it was when he first said the Center for Inquiry and kind of rolled his eyes. In this case, I think the eye roll is appropriate because these are organizations, like often is the case, that are just created merely for the purpose of agitation and litigation. And if this, as Todd said, if there were a group that were sincerely wanting to be part of the process and not just sort of trolling the religious and making an argument that believing in against religion is actually a religion. I think that there might be a hypothetical out there where a sincere organization may get a hearing, but this is just kind of rubbish litigation. And so I want to amen Todd's eye rolling.
Tim Golden, when I look at this, it's kind of interesting because it almost begs the question in our society, is marriage a religious ceremony, or is it really a government-sanctioned organizational activity? I've heard people talk about marriage as basically just the two mergers of different entities and trying to figure out how to stay merged. I mean, what exactly should marriage be? And at this point, should anybody be allowed to officiate as long as they make sure that they got the license?
Well, marriage is both of those things. Marriage, for many people, is deeply theological, deeply spiritual, right? It certainly has that dimension to it. But marriage is that theological institution and spiritual institution to many people that has very real civil consequences, right? The courts are recognized in the United States as an entity, a government entity, that is charged with the responsibility of enforcing rights in domestic relationships. This litigation, and this will be music to Todd McFarlane's ears, this litigation, I think, is left-wing politics run amok. It is an attempt to change who can do these ceremonies, but if you have these secularist groups, they don't have the machinery of government behind them that could civilly, I'm not even talking about the spiritual side of it, that could civilly legitimize, right, a union, right? So I think there would be serious questions about whether people who undertook to marry in front of such officials, putting officials in scare quotes, would actually be married in the legal sense of the term. So I think marriage is both spiritual, theological on one hand, and legal on the other, which is why Texas law properly recognizes judges, state and federal, as authorized to perform the marriage ceremonies, but not groups like the Center for Inquiry. Eye roll, a la Todd McFarlane, eat your heart out, right? So I think in the interest of protecting the rights of parties who marry on the civil side, it's important to really resist the claims of litigants like those in this case.
Yeah, Dr. Golden is spot on. It's the institution of marriage is a civil right, RIGHT, but also a civil right, RITE. Look, Texas isn't stopping anyone from having a secular wedding ceremony. What it's just saying is, if you want the legal authority to solemnize a marriage, you either do it through a recognized religious institution or through the civil system. And for a long time, states have made a deliberate choice. They allow religious officiants and civil officials like judges to perform marriages because those roles come with a recognized structure, accountability, and community legitimacy. So marriage isn't just expressive, it's a legal act with real consequences. So the state draws lines about who can solemnize it.
So this is really important. If you're a secular couple in Texas, you want a ceremony that highlights your secularity, you can have your humanist person stand up at the front and say all kinds of secular things. They can say that this marriage isn't blessed by God because God doesn't exist. You're free to say that even in Texas, right? But what you're not free to do is sort of say that has to be intertwined with the machinery of government because it somehow it counts as religious. It by definition isn't religious.
That is just, what Mr. Schultz was saying is absolutely right? That they aren't being denied the opportunity for a couple of things. First of all, there's plenty of people in religious, recognized religions that will do a secular service and never mention God. So that's available, and I think this really was a manufactured suit. You got to understand a lot of these organizations are able to raise a lot of money over these lawsuits, right? And I am sure this was in the Center for Inquiry's fundraising materials. And like I said, there's 2.16 million people in Tarrant County. For those that aren't familiar with Texas, that's the county that Fort Worth is in. You're telling me if they couldn't find two people in there that were secular that wanted them to marry, and there's really a problem? Like, the reason they couldn't find someone is because there's no one that really finds this to be a problem.
I think part of the confusion, Tim Schultz, is even this generation of younger people getting married right now, they almost live their lives, we go down to the courthouse, we'll get married, and at some point in time, we'll turn this into an official party and ceremony, maybe just to cause my parents to feel comfortable. I mean, that seems to be a bigger part of what's going on. Society has changed so much that they now have distinguished so clearly the difference between the legal part and the ritual or ceremonial part that I think that's what's creating even some of the confusion today.
Yeah, I mean, I think as society has become more secular and more raised about sex and marriage have changed, especially in America since the 1960s. We've seen a move away from the kind of what you might call the Christian covenantal view of marriage. It used to have at least a de facto respect in society, and now it's really more of a commercial or transactional understanding that people have. I think there's all kinds of reasons to worry about that, right? I think that there are all kinds of what economists call externalities to that kind of view of marriage that we've seen. I think caring about marriage culture, caring about the sacramental view of marriage that pretty much all Christians have, at least at some level, I'd love it if society would get back to that. I'm skeptical that it will without a fundamental underlying belief in Christianity itself. I think that the Christian understanding of marriage, if you'll forgive me, is sort of foolishness to the Greeks. I think unless you believe fundamentally in the Christian underlying worldview, then some of the ideas that Christians like us have about marriage seem relatively foolish and outdated.
Well, I think, Tim Golden, what we're kind of leaning into in all of this is we've got new generations that view marriage differently. The irony is you have a state like Texas that really is focusing on how you get married, and that might have a lot to do because when you get divorced in Texas, it looks very different than maybe anywhere else in the country with the exception of maybe California. So I guess maybe trying to figure out how you do it right on the front side may help you figure out how to do it best on the backside of this particular set of activities we call marriage.
Yeah, that's right, Orland. I think marriage is in a loose sort of almost jocular sense, the alpha and omega, right? The courts are there at the beginning and they're there at the end. You have to get a marriage license from the courts and you have to get a divorce decree from the courts, right? And I think expanding this idea of allowing other secularists who don't have the infrastructure or the support systems necessary to enforce these kinds of domestic relations rights ought to be kept out of the process in the interests of justice.
And I'm going to let that be the last word. I think where we're really kind of zeroing in as society changes, even the constructs of marriage can start to change. But in reality, the legal aspect of it, that's probably never going to change. So we need to make sure we stay focused on it. Hey, Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
Recently had a brush with sports celebrity greatness. I met Laker great and former Sixer killer, Byron Scott. I grew up, of course, in Philadelphia, and one of the most difficult things about being a Sixer fan during that time was watching Byron Scott pull up from beyond the three-point line and make a shot. In a break at the conference, I walked up to him, told him that he had to apologize for all the times he dashed the hopes of Sixer fans everywhere. And he looked at me and he said, well, you're not the first person that told me I had to apologize. I got fans in a lot of other cities who are mad at me too.
Oh my goodness. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Orland, all this talk about Texas has reminded me that this is the 20-year anniversary of the debut of the greatest network TV show of all time, Friday Night Lights. Also perhaps the best and most authentic portrayal of religion in America. So Orland, Texas forever.
Texas forever. Todd, tell me something I don't know.
Secretary Pete Hegseth has 2 Bronze Stars, but what you may not know was that critics of him have been criticizing Bronze Stars for not having the same weight they did before, calling them participation trophies. It is true that military honors have not had the same weight they have in the past. In fact, a lot of people in the military say for promotion purposes, only the top couple of awards make any type of difference now in promotions.
Wow. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military council in the armed forces, do not have any operational command authority individually or collectively over U.S. military forces. They serve strictly as advisors rather than commanders.
Wow.
And Dr. Golden, as a Portland Trailblazer fan, the Lakers also ruined my childhood.
Gentlemen, always good being here with you and loved our conversation. And thanks again for you being here. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith in politics. See you next time.